Hello, and welcome to my lecture on the Progressive Era. My name is Sarah, and I'm going to be covering what happened between 1900 and 1917. So, as I said, I will be talking about the Progressive Era, and the origins of this era ultimately started in 1820 during those state reforms, and then it furthered on with the election of Theodore Roosevelt. He was the first president in the Progressive Era, and it was pretty good. I think it was pretty good. The presidents that were in the Progressive Era consisted of Theodore Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Who were the progressives, you might ask? They were very diverse groups, consisting of Protestant church leaders, African Americans, union leaders, women, and they were mostly members of the middle class, women and men. They were all progressives and united under the sole belief that the society was in desperate need of change. They developed and adopted this new philosophy called pragmatism. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing it wrong. But pragmatism is a new philosophy that enabled them to challenge fixed notions that stood in the way of reform. What this meant was that if anything got in their way of reforming their society, they could take charge and fix this problem. So, obviously, there were newspapers and magazines that were being written and produced for the public to inform them on what was going on. Well, muckrakers were writers of these newspapers who exposed the problems in politics, factories, and in the slums of the newspapers during the time of President Roosevelt. They felt that it was their duty to inform the society of the scandalous realities that needed reforming. The first muckraker was Henry Lloyd from Chicago, who attacked the practices of the Standard Oil Company and railroads. Books and series were written and published, and these books were actually best-selling books, really good. However, they declined in 1910 for two reasons. One reason being that the writers couldn't top their last story. They couldn't write as good as their previous story. So it became not as impactful or effective on the readers. Second reason is that the publishers faced economic pressures from the bank because as they were trying to expand, they needed more money from the bank. However, the bank didn't want to give them all that money, so then they just failed. However, their goal was ultimately accomplished because they overall exposed the inequities, educated the public about the corruption, and prepared the way for corrective action. So the first type of reform I'm going to go over are political reforms. And I'm going to touch on the secret ballot, the direct primaries, the direct election of senators, and initiative, referendum, and recall systems. So, on to the secret ballot. Before, when voters went to vote, the political parties would manipulate and intimidate them by standing there and watching them vote and place their ballot in the box, their vote in the box. However, in Australia, it started where they created this secret box so that these voters could receive their privacy and vote, because sometimes they felt that they needed to vote for a certain person if someone was watching them. So the secret ballot offered these voters their chance to vote for who they truly felt should be elected for whatever election was going on. By 1910, all the states adopted the secret ballot. Before, the Republicans and Democrats nominated the candidates for state and federal elections and offices. However, after, in 1903, the progressive governor of Wisconsin introduced new systems for bypassing politicians and placing the nominating processes in the hands of the voters, hence the direct primaries. My second point here. Well, it's my third, but this is 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so 2. Direct primaries. By 1915, some form of direct primary was used in every single state. This basically put the voting process in the hands of the people, and they could, that's my dog, and they could elect anyone they felt deserved it. The system basically ultimately overthrew the boss rule. Before the U.S. senator was chosen by state legislatures rather than the direct vote of the people. So they were granted direct election of senators. By 1912, 30 states adopted this reform, and by 1913, the adoption of the 17th Amendment was adopted. And this required that all U.S. senators were to be elected by popular vote of the people. Our last and final point regarding political reforms is the, up here, initiative, referendum, and recall. So if legislators failed to obey the will of the people, the progressives proposed 2 methods to force them to act. 1, the initiative, which meant that voters could compel legislature to consider a bill. 2, the referendum, I don't know if I'm saying that, referendum, allowed citizens to vote on proposed laws printed on a ballot. And there was a third measure, which is called the recall. This enabled voters to remove a corrupt politician from office by majority vote. So before their term was over, the people had a right to say, we don't like you, here are our reasons, you need to go, and they could do that. The second reform I will be discussing is the municipal reform. Municipal reform. So, the first target of the progressives was the corrupt alliances that city bosses had with local businesses. Regarding the control of public utilities, my first point, the reform leaders wanted to take utilities out of the hands of the private companies. So by 1915, 2/3 of the nation's cities owned their own water systems. This also enabled cities to become owners and operate the gas lines, power plants, urban transportation systems. On my second point, the commissions and city managers, this basically meant that voters could elect the heads of their city. The policemen, the firemen, the postal services, they could elect the heads for these city departments. And by 1923, over 300 cities had developed this manager council plan of municipal government. The next reform I will be discussing is the state reform, which includes temperance and prohibition, social welfare, and child and women labor. Temperance and prohibition. They wanted to polish their morals because they felt that drinking alcohol was horrible and frowned upon. So they wanted to get rid of this. So by 1915, prohibitionists convinced the legislatures of 2/3 of the states to prohibit any sale of alcohol. Social welfare, my second point. Social justice movements pushed for better schools, juvenile courts, divorce laws, and safety regulations. There was a limit on the death penalty, and once you served your time in prison, you were offered probation with a parole, and these were all developed. Child and women labor. The children were kept out of the factories and mines and forced to go to school by 1907. There was a law put in place saying that the attendance of students was required to keep them out of these working areas. For the women, they fought long and hard to get their hours reduced and wanted laws put for their safety. Excuse me, my dog is gnawing. The women fought long and hard to get their laws passed so that they could work shorter hours and ultimately benefit their health. Then, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1911 occurred. This sparked greater women's activism and motivated states to pass laws to improve safety and working conditions in factories. Anyway, the Shirtwaist Fire basically pushed for these laws to further protect the women and their safety conditions. Next on the agenda is the Teddy Roosevelt Square Deal. This basically was put into place because Roosevelt wanted to create a fair, honest, and just society in which everyone had an equal chance to succeed. Roosevelt also made these benefits: trust busting, railroad regulation, consumer protection, and conservation. So, trust busting. This was kind of a lead off of the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's a stem, and Roosevelt wanted to break up the bad trusts and regulate the good trusts. This ultimately would dominate the market. Railroad regulation. Number 2. He passed 2 laws to strengthen Interstate Commerce Commission, which I will refer to as ICC because I don't want to say Interstate Commerce Commission, however many times I used it. The Elkins Act of 1903. The ICC had greater authority to stop the railroads from granting rebates to favored customers. And the second law is the Hepburn Act of 1906. The commission could fix just and reasonable rates for railroads. Now, I hate to say it, but Theodore Roosevelt's presidency has come to an end, and William Taft is now in office in 1903. Okay, wait, I'm missing a paper. Oh, wait. Just kidding. It's not him yet. I still have to talk about the consumer protection and conservation. Backtrack. Still in Roosevelt. Consumer protection on this paper right here. There were 2 acts that were passed: the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. The Meat Inspection Act basically said that there would be federal inspections going on and visiting the meat packing industries to ensure that they met the standards of sanitation. The Pure Food and Drug Act forbade manufacturing, sale, and transportation of adulterated or mislabeled food products. My last point before Taft is conservation. Roosevelt was a major naturist and loved the outdoors and animals, so he pushed for this conservation. There were 2 acts. The Forest Reserve Act of 1891, which is a little before the Progressive Era, but still impacted it. It set aside 150 million acres of federal land as national reserve that could not be sold. The second act is the New Land Reclamation Act of 1902 during the Progressive Era, a law providing money for irrigation projects. So it basically pushed for these for future agricultural aspects. Now, we're into Taft's presidency of 1908. He continued with Roosevelt's trust-busting ways. However, the progressives weren't very impressed with his achievements because they also accused him of betraying their progressive cause. And here are the reasons. He wanted to lower taxes, but instead he signed the Payne-Aldrich tariff, which raised the taxes and tariffs. So the progressives were kind of confused by that. And he failed to reduce the dictatorial powers of the Congress. So he allowed the Congress to have their dictatorship, and he didn't reduce it like he said he would. So this led to the rise of the Socialist Party. It called for more radical reforms than the progressives favored. The public ownership of railroads, utilities, and major industries is what the Populist Party fought for. After that whole thing, the election of 1912 occurred. This was between, three people. The Republicans, not the progressive Republicans, just the Republicans nominated Taft. The progressive Republicans nominated Roosevelt again. And the Democrats nominated Woodrow Wilson. Woody Wilson. The results. Drumroll, please. Wilson won less than a majority of the popular votes, but he won the electoral votes. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Wilsonian Progressive, which is from progressivism, which is from 1912 to 1916. Woo! Wilson had this new freedom view. New freedom, that's what he called it. And it basically favored small enterprise, entrepreneurship, and the free functioning of unregulated and unmonopolized markets. He also, so these three things that he achieved: tariff reduction, banking reform, and business regulation. Tariff reduction, number uno. He passed the Underwood Tariff in 1913, which substantially lowered tariffs, and he included a graduated income tax of 6%. It went from 1% to 6%. Regarding the banking, due to the Federal Reserve Act of 1914, it granted a national banking system with 12 district banks, one for each regional district. 12 districts, one bank for each district. And it issued paper money. Business regulation. The Clayton Antitrust Act strengthened the provisions in the Sherman Antitrust Act for breaking up monopolies. So it was, again, a stem off of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And the Federal Trade Commission could take action against any unfair trade practice. Good job, Woody Wilson. In 1916, the Federal Farm Loan Act, it was basically 12 federal farm loan banks that were established to provide these farmers with loans at low interest rates. And this would be very needed in the World War I because, I won't spoil it, but they needed loans from the bank. Child Labor Act of 1916, it prohibited the shipment of products manufactured by children under the age of 14. No items manufactured by children under 14 were allowed to be shipped. Yes. African Americans in progressive era. How do they play a role? Well, I'll tell you. They were actually ignored by the progressive presidents, and their status declined since the Reconstruction period. So it was kind of really sad. And during this progressive era is when lynching was so popular, for lack of better words, and more common. So the progressives really didn't do anything about the segregation and lynching. But there were two African Americans that arose from this. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. They had two views. Both wanted equality for the African Americans, but I'll show you the difference. Booker T. Washington argued that blacks, African Americans, needed education and economic teaching and learning the industrial skills. And they felt that this was needed so that they could be equal to the rest of the population. He felt that in order for them to be equal, they needed to be able to succeed and prosper at the things that whites were succeeded and prospering at. However, W.E. Du Bois simply straight up demanded the rights for African Americans. He didn't say, oh, well, we need to learn these things so that we can have a chance at being equal. No, he demanded it. Yes, this led to the Great Migration. International migration began in 1910 towards the north from the south. Reasons for migration include job opportunities, trying to escape the Jim Crow laws, and the cornfields in the south were destructed. Last but not least, the women in Progressive Era. They fought hard for the rights to vote and got the 19th Amendment passed. The 19th Amendment guaranteed women's right to vote in all elections. So, all of this covered the Progressive Era. If you have any questions, comments below. I hope I enlightened you on the Progressive Era. Thank you. Signing off.